The town of Vinton, Virginia lies on the south and southeast edges of the city of Roanoke, once the hometown of the Norfolk Southern Railroad. The railroad has moved its headquarters to Atlanta, but the huge complex of yards remains. The muscular, industrial appearance can be misleading, however. Roanoke has been selected as an all-American city repeatedly, and with good reason. The crime rate is relatively low, and mostly penny ante. Violent crimes are rare. The murder of the Hodges was a shock to the community. The murder was of the entire Hodges family: Blaine Hodges, his wife, Teresa Hodges, two daughters of the couple, Winter aged 11 and Anna aged 3. The two children had been shot in the head twice, the father shot once in the head, and Teresa the mother had been strangled and set on fire. She was downstairs, all others upstairs in bed. The house had been closed up and the fire did little damage to the inside of the house. Teresa had been burned badly, but it was still determined that she had been strangled and was wearing only a pair of turquoise panties. Her white shorts were found across the room, and she was lying on the rest of her clothing. The Vinton Police and the Violent Crime Unit of the Virginia State Police investigated the crime. Barry Kesey was the senior investigator for the case. Although Kesey claimed he thought it was a murder-suicide for over 10 hours, he went to Earl Bramblett's place of employment the morning of the crime. He claimed he only knew it wasn't murder-suicide late that same afternoon. There was a part of a handgun found on the floor beside Blaine Hodges' bed that was missing a barrel. The forensic firearms examiner ruled it could not have been the murder weapon, not because of the missing barrel, but because the manufacturer's specifications ruled it out. The manufacturer's specifications' inner barrel configurations did not match the bullets found in the victims. Later, approximately 2 years later, this same firearms expert wrote Kesey a letter indicating this gun could be the murder weapon, because of one he found like it had the required inner barrel configurations that matched the bullets in the victims. Why he would remember this particular case was never explained either. He was never asked about this at trial. Later, he would write a letter saying he lied, too much later. With this new information about the piece of gun, a reluctant Commonwealth attorney, reluctant until this letter, proceeded with a grand jury indictment. Earl Bramblett was arrested in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where he had been living since his attorney told him to leave the Roanoke, VA area shortly after the crime. He was working at a trade in which he was a master, silk screen printing, and had bought a house and somehow acquired a 3-legged dog. The police had been watching him for a couple of days before this arrest and went in with their guns drawn as if he were some violent offender. Earl Conrad Bramblett's only brush with the law was about 20 years back when he was found guilty of drunk driving and writing a bad check at about that same time. There was no violence anywhere in Earl Bramblett's background. Earl Bramblett became friends with the Hodges family, and he often visited them. All seemed to be well with the Hodges and their friend Earl Bramblett until Blaine decided to borrow some money from his postal drawer. He had done this a couple of months before, but had managed to replace it before it was discovered. This time he wasn't so lucky. He was charged with the crime and found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in federal prison and had to pay back twice the amount he had stolen, which amounted to about $9,000. Blaine Hodges never revealed for what he needed the money or on what he spent it. It is known that he didn't use the money to pay bills or buy anything obvious such as a car or cameras or anything tangible he showed to anyone. The postal inspector knew, but he was not allowed to testify to what it was. Blaine Hodges was really angry at the post office and showed the supervisor a check after he was fired and said, "I'll make a lot more money than that job paid." She said it looked like a government check. For some reason, Earl thought that Blaine had made some kind of deal with the police to entrap him and thereby Blaine would escape going to jail. This is a ridiculous idea to people who are not paranoid, but very real to someone who is. Earl thought this entrapment employed Winter, the 11-year-old, to do inappropriate things, like standing on her head while wearing a dress or running around the house without a top on, in an effort to get Earl to do something inappropriate with or to her. Again, this is not the thinking of a rational person, but of someone who is paranoid to the point of obsession. The child's normal childish behavior, in Earl's eyes, became a sinister enticement. Earl bought a small recorder and started cataloging the events as he saw them and sometimes even left the recorder running in the Hodges house to see if he could find what they were plotting against him. All this time he is the friend of the family, thinking that Blaine is forcing his wife and daughter into doing these things to entrap him against their will. He held them blameless and continued his support of the family by still working Blaine whenever he could and being a benefactor of the family. Bramblett lived in a travel trailer at one of the businesses where he worked but spent a lot of time at the Hodges. Earl sold the trailer and paid Blaine to help him deliver it to North Carolina. Earl then spent his time at the Hodges, cheap motels, in his truck and traveling around the country. On July 30, 1996, Earl Bramblett was finally arrested for capital murder in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where he had been living since shortly after leaving Roanoke. He was working at a print shop and had bought a house, which he had deeded to his two sons. He was returned to Roanoke and was arraigned for capital murder and spent the next full year in the Roanoke County Jail while awaiting trial. Judge Roy Willett, 23rd Judicial Circuit, appointed the most inept and inexperienced lawyer that has practiced in the Roanoke Valley to represent Bramblett, and he in turn hired another lawyer noted for losing what should be easily won cases. This judge has since been relieved of his duties on the bench, because of his gruffness and his interest in saving time more than in justice. In any case, the trial was noteworthy because the defense presented no evidence to refute the prosecution's thinly disguised attempt to convict Bramblett on an unnatural interest in the 11-year-old child. There was absolutely no evidence to substantiate such a charge, and just about any other lawyer would have strenuously objected to such a suggestion. The coroner's report even stated there was no evidence of either child ever being sexually molested, and the report also stated Winter still a virgin. There was also a piece of a revolver found next to Blaine Hodges' body on the floor. The firearm was missing a barrel and the bullets in the victims were fired from a gun with a barrel as evidenced by the markings called lands and grooves. The ballistics expert first said this could not have been the murder weapon and later changed his story to say it could have been the murder weapon and in trial testified it was the murder weapon. But Bramblett said all the circumstantial evidence used against him had either been planted or fabricated. He said his pubic hair sample was taken before authorities located the hair on the girl's bed, and that his tape recordings had been altered to give the impression he was attracted to Winter. Earl Conrad Bramblett was sentenced to death on December 16, 1997, after the jury deliberated for 1 hour. On April 9, 2003, Earl Conrad Bramblett was executed. He was 61 years old at the time of his death, choosing the electric chair over lethal injection as a form of protest. Bramblett was only the third Virginia inmate to die in the electric chair since condemned prisoners were given the option of electrocution or lethal injection in 1995. Bramblett was led into the execution chamber at 8:54 p.m. and strapped into the oak electric chair built by inmates. "I didn't murder the Hodges family," Bramblett said firmly in his final statement. "I've never murdered anybody. I'm going to my death with a clear conscience," Bramblett said. I am going to my death having had a great life because of my two great sons, who visited Bramblett earlier in the day along with his ex-wife. A Department of Corrections official then turned a key switch in the wall behind the electric chair, activating the system. An executioner sitting behind a one-way glass immediately pressed a button labeled Execute, and 1,800 volts surged through Bramblett's body, causing him to go rigid and throwing him against the back of the chair. Bramblett's head and right leg were shaved to allow skin-tight attachments of 2 electrodes. During the execution, a puff of smoke rose from the electrode on his right leg. After waiting 5 minutes, Dr. Alvin Harris, a corrections physician, walked into the death chamber and placed his stethoscope against Bramblett's chest. "This man has expired," Harris announced. Bramblett was pronounced dead at 9:09 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett. Thank you for watching Death Row.